I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about lesson 24 of our study, which covers the book of Exodus, chapter 32. Here again, we're back into action. Though considering what happens, maybe it would have been better not to. We see, as Moses has been up on the mountain having this conversation with God on behalf of these people, what they're doing down below, including Moses' brother Aaron. And what they're doing is not good, not at all good. They set up and they almost immediately set up and begin worshiping a false idol, this molten calf made of gold, that they give credit for the things that God did for them. And so they put it in the place of God, and they put Aaron in the place of Moses. And they have a big party. And that rightly first gets God pretty angry. And Moses talks him down, and then Moses gets down and sees what's happening, and Moses himself gets pretty angry. And then we have the consecration by blood of the Levites, which we'll talk about a lot more. That's a very interesting thing. And then Moses seeks to offer atonement for and to right the relationship of the people with God. This sets a pattern. God's not wrong when he says this is a stiff-necked people. Maybe, it would be better to go another way. Except that all people are stiff-necked people, right? Like, there's not another way to go, as it turns out. The unfortunate reality of the situation is he's not going to do better than this, which probably ultimately is why the arrangement is allowed to persist. We're all, and I think that's our big area for reflection here, is what the people do is ridiculous, but we do that too, right? Likewise, the things that God has done for us in our lives, we assign false credit for elsewhere, don't attribute to God, and are more than happy to worship things that are not God. This seems not relatable because most people aren't making a golden calf, right? But the golden calf is just it's just a representation of people talk about connections to gods in Egypt, and there's probably some of that, but it's also it's made out of gold, and cattle were also like a primary means of property and wealth among these people as well. So you could see it as they're worshiping creation and not the creator, right? And if you look at it and money, also, if you look at it that way, there are lots of times we do that, right? Where we attribute to stuff reverence that should belong to God. So as we're reading this, and it looks as ridiculous as it is, the cause for reflection for all of us isn't, those people were so stupid. It's, oh my, I'm so stupid, right? Because we do these things. So that's, I think as we read through this, that's the area for reflection for us, is where are we making similar and ridiculous mistakes? While Moses is up on the mountain having this conversation with God, the people approach Aaron and say, make us gods. Moses hasn't been around for a little while. We don't know what happened to him. Um, no, they do describe him as the man who brought us from the land of Egypt. They're like, yeah, he did some stuff for us, but we haven't seen him in like 20 days. So like, who cares about that? That guy is old news, right? Like that guy and his God, with the shaking and the thundering and the fearfulness at the base of the mountain and all that, that was weeks ago. Like we don't remember that. We don't care. We want to be serving gods now. So, and those ones are gone. So Aaron, help us out. You're the next one in charge. We need gods to worship. What are you going to do about it? You're in charge now. And Aaron said, well, I guess I'm in charge, and if that's the problem, okay, you want gods, I guess everybody give me some gold and let's make some gods. I think the really important thing here is Aaron makes this thing, and that's really bad, right? No doubt, that's really bad. It wasn't his idea. And it's these people and not Aaron who acknowledge this calf as a god. And they say, they being the people, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and not Aaron. That and Moses hadn't gotten down yet with the commandments and told them to the people, right? If the people had the commandments already, this would be worse. You can't judge people according to a law that they don't have yet and aren't bound to yet. So this is the last little grace period before they bound themselves to the idea of that first commandment. So there's that. And for Aaron's sake, it wasn't his idea, and he didn't yet call the calf a god. But like he was incredibly he was involved in the whole thing, right? He was complicit. He doesn't get a buy, but it wasn't his idea. So when we get to the thing that happens, and you wonder why it doesn't happen to Aaron, it's because it wasn't his idea. And as he explains to Moses, he felt kind of trapped. He makes very poor decisions, right? Like terrible spiritual leader. And that raises a question also for our own priests, right? Like, okay, they don't help people worship golden calves, right? But we've all, I think, probably known priests on the very much more permissive and lenient side versus priests who are not so much that. The temptation here is you're responsible for the spiritual well-being. I presume, I'm not in that place personally, so I'm projecting a little bit, but I presume like being responsible for the spiritual welfare and the well-being of these people. If you have a lot of people coming to you concerned, confused, applying pressure about a thing, it's easy, I would think, for someone without a really deeply rooted relationship with God to start giving deference to the voice of the people that's loud and present over the voice of God that at best might be soft and distant, right? Remember, Aaron doesn't have a relationship with God directly. Aaron has a relationship with Moses. Aaron doesn't know this God that the people are willing to abandon. He does know Moses, but he also knows the people, and that immediate pressure of what the people are doing without Moses there and with no relationship of his own with God. Can you really? Yes, you can. But can you really blame the guy? Yes. Can you kind of understand how he could do what he did? Also, yes. The warning there for our priests is, where are you listening where are you taking your, or even like parents, right? Anyone responsible for the spiritual well-being of others, where are you, what are you listening to, right? Where's your guidance coming? Do you have that relationship with God to pass on, or don't you? Because if you don't, ultimately what happens here is what's going to happen, right? Like, because it's not your own relationship with God, if it's not rooted in anything, your own faith, then you have nothing to pass on. And those challenges will whittle away at what you have. Personally, I think that is a part of the reason that a lot of young people, my generation and beyond, have left the faith, is they have parents who practiced but who themselves never really had their own deep relationship with God in a lot of cases, right? Our society used to have a lot more expectations that you just be Christian, whether you really had the relationship with God or not, right? It's just what you did. You went to church, you participated in a faith life, whether it was real that you had it or not. And so we had a lot of people, former hippies, in many cases, who never really got from their parents a relationship with God that they built and had for themselves. So they didn't really have much to pass on to their kids other than, hey, you're supposed to go to church because we go to church. And the kids said, well, I don't care about that. Why? What's going on? And they pushed back. And the parents had nothing to give to address and to answer that, right? And in many cases, kids didn't find it themselves. And you had people in droves leave the church in my generation and beyond, and they still are. And that's bad, certainly, but it's not all on that generation that it's happening, right? It's kind of the fruit of a bigger problem. And like somewhere along the line, the communication, the transmission of faith, like it weakened, right? It didn't happen. And I'm not necessarily just saying it's my parents' generation that are the ones that dropped the ball, right? If they're not getting what they need either to have that solid relationship, you could point the finger at least another generation up for where that breakdown happened. Somewhere along the line, originally as the church was growing, the people joining clearly were all in and had that relationship with God. By the time it becomes just an expectation of culture and society that you go to church, you end up with a lot of people going to church who have no relationship with God and trying to raise children to go to church who maybe, and the important thing is that you go to church and maybe there's no relationship with God passed on because somewhere along the way nobody had it and they kept going to church, but they stopped passing on really that knowledge of and relationship with God. And at some point it became socially acceptable not to go to church. And so all these people who were faking it for so long, or were just doing it because it's the thing you're supposed to do, suddenly said, sleeping in on Sunday mornings is pretty awesome. And I'm no longer going to be ostracized if I'm not going to church every week. Maybe this week I won't go. And then they think, that was pretty great. I like sleeping in on Sundays. Maybe next week I won't go. And the next thing you know, and I'm not sure I believe any of that anyway. Like, what's the big deal about all of that? And the next thing you know, you have people in droves not going to church anymore. And it seems like there's this big crisis of people leaving the faith. But in reality, it's people who were at church who really weren't fully engaged anyway. And the problem dates back years and generations. You see how easy it is for Aaron, who had a great relationship with Moses, but never had his own relationship with God, to just lead everyone astray. And it's a thing that happens. It's an interesting thing to think about. For us, the important challenge, again, anyone who's in a position to be passing on the faith, is think about what you're passing on, right? You yourself have to cultivate your relationship with God to have something to pass on. That's what you're trying to pass on, is a relationship with God. You're not trying to pass on rules, right? You're not trying to pass on, we go to church, we don't do that, we try to be nice to people. If you pass on like the external facade of Christianity to your kids, and that's what you're supposed to do to be Christian, they're not going to have a relationship with God, and it's not going to last. The thing you're trying to do is help them get to know Jesus, and Jesus will help them figure out how to live their lives, right? But we somehow, along the line, we thought it was about all those external things and not about the internal thing. And when you make it that, there's no foundation for it. And then as soon as the mildest inconvenience happens, like Moses has been gone for a couple weeks, then everybody's like, oh, well, enough of that stuff. Might as well do something else. And there's no foundation to keep it there. So is this thing people do bad? Yes. Is it understandable? Also, yes. None of them has that deeply rooted foundation in a relationship with God yet to keep them on the right path. They should still have known better, but it is somewhat understandable. This gets a little worse for Aaron. Here, okay, so they said this is our God, and he didn't. But then he turns around and says, well, we need an altar for it then. And, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. If you look at, how the text formats it, you can tell, like, when the word Lord is in all caps, like, that's a big deal word that's definitely reserved for the Lord. It's not like tomorrow shall be a feast for cow god who's it, right? Like, he's using language reserved for the Lord to describe this golden calf. Like, that's really bad news on Aaron's part. And then they make offerings, but like, this is a party, right? This isn't, oh, we're sorry, cow god, for our transgressions in the land of Egypt. It's, hey, new God, let's have a party. And that's they're doing some of the things of religion, but they're doing them like, it's just what we were just talking about, right? Like, it's the facade of, let's do religious-y things so it can feel like we have this religion, but the thing we're serving is fake, and we're going to serve our own interests by it instead of a God. We're going to have a party rather than, penance. Religion should be fun. Moses in that old way, I wasn't having any fun with that. And he's gone, so let's do it again, but let's make it fun this time. Really seems to be their attitude. Here we see how ready God is to disown these people when he says to Moses, go down for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt. Like, God is linguistically distancing himself from these people, right? It's no longer my people. Like, obviously personification of God, we're giving him some human traits here for the sake of relatability, but the idea is that God is very upset and has decided, like, in his current state of mind is done with these people. They are not my people. Moses, they're your problem. Go deal with your problem. They're your people. I don't want anything to do with these people. That is a correct depiction of what happens when we violate the covenant, right? Even now, right? Like, if you are in a state of grace and you were baptized and have committed no mortal sins since then, you are in union with God, right? You are God's people. If you turn from God and say, ooh, shiny, or whatever, or I'm not having any fun, I'm going to go do that, and you commit a mortal sin, right? You make a deliberate, informed decision to turn away from God, then you are not God's people, right? You cut yourself off. You sever yourself from the people of God. That's what these people have done, right? They have sinned gravely, mortally, and God's statement is reflecting, his use of pronouns is reflecting, Moses, they aren't my people now. They're your people. They're not mine. So go deal with them how you want to, because, like, not my people anymore. He's angry, and he's intending, like, death for them, right? But more importantly, like, he just doesn't care, right? Like, I'm done with those people. Moses, you didn't sin, so I can make a great nation of you. You are my people now, because, like, you didn't sin, and you're who's left, right? This is what sin does. This isn't just God, like, rethinking, like God changed his mind and then he changes his mind again and then he changes his mind again, which is, I think, how some people read this. This is an accurate depiction of what grave sin does to your relationship with God. The people were in relationship with God. They sinned gravely. They are now not in relationship with God. Moses still is, so God's thinking the state that things are in right now, he has to fulfill his promises through Moses. That is the state of what's going on here, is you sin gravely, you sever your relationship with God. Here then, an interesting thing happens, and that is, remember, for context here, Moses hasn't actually seen what they're doing yet, right? God's described it, but Moses is still on the mountain, right? God has seen it clearly because God can see everything at once. Moses has just heard God's report of it, and so hasn't gotten the full effect yet. But Moses' argument also has more to do with God than with the people, right? The people are incidental to this, and Moses' point is, God, you're the one, like, whose reputation is on the line here, right? You're the one who brought these people out of Egypt and have already, in everybody else's eyes, already claimed these people. If we then just murder them all, then everybody's going to say, going to attribute that to you, right? What kind of God just kills his people? And, you know, even if we try to say, no, guys, let me explain, they had it coming, like, really? Like, it's really bad PR, God, if you're trying to build your name among all the nations and you start this way. It's just really bad PR. Maybe we could try to salvage this, but it is about, from Moses' argument, and I think probably Moses' genuine perspective, it's not so much that Moses wants to save the people's relationship with God so much as he thinks it's better for God. And that is his argument. And that's why Moses can say that, right? Moses has to be sick of these people too. And he's going to get even more so. But Moses' concern is what he perceives to be in the best interest of God. Imagine if Aaron down below were thinking likewise about what would be in the best interest of God. Then none of that would be happening, right? Moses is modeling correctly how one mediates between the people and God. It is mediation that is in service of God, not in service of the people, right? Like, and that's an interesting thing for us to think about as well when we pray in most forms, right? Are we praying on our behalf or on God's? If we're praying on our behalf, we're like the people at the bottom of the mountain. I could use some stuff. I'm not having any fun. I'm bored. Whatever. If we're praying like Moses, it's, God, I think this is what's best for you. And so that's what I have in mind to do. And praying that way involves, aligning ourselves in mind and heart enough with God that that prayer can be an offering of God. This is what I perceive is best for you. Let's do this. And, if it's not, let me know. That's how you build a relationship and mediate with God. And again, we're so selfish. I think, I won't speak for all of you, but when I hear people talking about how they pray, it is so often so selfish. And when I do myself sometimes, right? Most of the time, if I'm being too honest. It's easy for the prayers to be about me, 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 me. Or, the people I love are still very me-centered, right? And not God-centered. Try to maintain a friendship that way, huh? Like, if you're always talking about and wanting to make the friendship and what you're talking about, what you're doing, what you're focusing on with your friends is always about you, how long are you going to have friends and how close are they going to be, right? You're not going to have any close friends doing that, right? You might have people who can tolerate you from time to time at some social functions, but you're definitely not going to have people going out of their way to spend time with you and really getting close to you. But we think God is going to, we think relationship with God magically works like, God, you love me, so it's okay if this is all about me. Because I love me too. We have that in common. It's a great foundation for a relationship. Except, of course, usually we don't really love us. And we're kind of hoping to fake it. Just food for thought and reflection. And the contrast here is so potent, is maybe our relationship with God isn't supposed to be all about us. And if it is, maybe we're doing it wrong. This conversation with God started when God said, Moses, you need to get down there. So Moses is going down. He's got these stone tablets, and we're reminded now that Joshua has been up there with Moses. Whether he was up there, or whether Moses meets him down, Joshua is, and only Joshua is up on the mountain with Moses, which we've already talked about some of that symbolism, but in case you're coming in new or you don't remember it, the name Joshua is due to translation issues in different alphabets and things that get repeated a lot getting normalized. We did not translate the name Yeshua, Jesus, the same way we translate the name Yeshua, Joshua. Jesus' name has some Aramaic tense to it that Joshua's doesn't, but they're the same name, but they get translated differently. So these guys seem to have two different names when they don't. And they have basically the same name. So when we're thinking about who else can go up on the mountain and hang out there, and you have Moses, and you just happen to have Joshua hanging out there, and you connect that Joshua and Jesus have the same names, well, that makes a whole lot of sense, doesn't it? As we're recording this video, a thing that's been on my mind, we're in the season of Lent, and we had the reading of the Transfiguration in Mass this morning. And, an interesting thing about the Transfiguration, I think, is, we always think it's such an odd thing that, Moses and Elijah are up there on the mountain. But I don't think that's actually the point of the Transfiguration at all. They belong there, right? The odd people on the mountain are Peter, James, and John. Like, those are the ones who don't belong. Moses and Elijah belong, right? Moses here is hanging out on the mountain, as is Yeshua. Those guys belong on the mountain. The people who don't belong yet at the point of the transfiguration are these bums that Jesus brings up with him. And what that's saying and marking is that Jesus can transport, like, Moses doesn't bring anybody up the mountain with him, except Joshua, who's, as we talked about, an odd, interesting figure. But when Moses comes up the mountain, everyone stays down below. When Jesus comes up the mountain, people come with him. And that's the neat and the new thing about the transfiguration. The thing that Moses can't do is get anybody else to come up the mountain. And Jesus just says, hey guys, you want to go up the mountain? And they say, oh, sure. And then they get up there and say, oh, we should build tents for these guys who have been up here for a long time. And Jesus, you're missing the point, but it's good that you saw this. Now don't tell anyone. It's such a different thing. But so we see Joshua up the mountain, and that's the type of Jesus, right? So that's the thing. But Moses and Joshua are going down the mountain, and Joshua is thinking, there's a lot of noise. The only reason they would be making this much noise is if there's some kind of battle or conflict, because they definitely wouldn't be throwing a big party to a false god. Joshua doesn't have the info that Moses did, right? Moses was talking to God, and Moses knows what they're doing. Joshua doesn't, and he can't fathom, like, it's not entering his mind that this could possibly be what it is, because he wouldn't ever do that. And presumably if he were down there, he would be doing preemptively what some of the Levites are doing in a little while, because he's also a military guy. He just can't fathom. Like, I hear them crying and shouting and singing. Like, wait, is that... Sounds like they're having a party, but they shouldn't be having a party. And he's confused, which points to Joshua. He just can't. It's kind of like the Grinch coming down or listening up on the mountain after he stole all the Christmas things. And it's like, they're not crying. They're supposed to be crying. They're singing. That's not what should be happening, except it's the opposite, right? Instead of like, still all the Who's down in Whoville still like celebrating Christmas came anyway, right? Without all the stuff and the true meaning and spirit of Christmas, and the Grinch's heart grows multiple sizes. Like, instead, the subversion of expectations here is the opposite, right? Instead of it being good, which Joshua is still trying to assume it is, it's actually terrible. But so they're coming down the mountain. Joshua doesn't know what's happening. They get down. Moses sees it, and he is also very, very angry. He throws down the tablets, which is probably good for the people. They don't want to be bound by that right now. And maybe if you can destroy the evidence. I don't think he's doing it to try to absolve the people. He's just doing it because he's angry, but also it's symbolic of what happened again, right? Like, this is the covenant the people formed with God, carved into stone. It's broken, right? Like, the covenant is broken, so the tablets are broken. It is a reflection of the state of what happened. And then clearly, like, the people are obviously afraid of Moses, right? When he shows up, everybody falls back in line to the point that they all watch him burn up this calf and break it down into powder, scatter the powder in some water and say, okay, here, you all need to drink this now. And everybody goes along with that. Like, they're clearly mortified, or like, mortified in the sense of, the word mortal is in the word mortify, right? In the more literal sense of, they're very much feeling their mortality right now when Moses is coming back down and is obviously so upset with them, right? For whatever reason, nobody thought this might happen. And like, nobody is comfortable when it is. Like, they just wrote him off entirely and decided he was never coming back. But when he comes back, they're at least willing to do what he's saying. because they know his relationship with God and what God can do. Um, Again, it seems so weird when you know what God can do and who he has on his side, and you're very afraid of those things. How, when they're not around for a little while, how could you just go off and do whatever else? We would never do that, right? Like, we would never, like, it's been a while since I was at church and nobody, religious is around, so I'm just going to go do this other thing now. And definitely God's not going to find out about it because he doesn't know everything, and it's going to be fine. Again, we do this. We do this. But when we see other people do it, it looks so stupid. But when we do it, it's just like, oh, yeah, that's what I did. And it was fine. But then it stopped being fine. And like, we don't have the self-reflection to realize how stupid we're being because, we want to do what we want to do. And we're good at deceiving ourselves. But when we see other people do it, man, that's stupid. This part is pretty straightforward, but it's also one of the funniest things in the Bible is also in here. So Moses then talks to Aaron and says, what gives? These people offended you so much that you would lead them into this? Like, what did they do to you that you'd be willing to, from Moses' point of view, right? Aaron is responsible for the well-being of the people. And Aaron, by failing the people now, is responsible for, what's about to happen, for the well-being of the people. Because Moses himself internalizes his role for the people that way, right? Like, I'm responsible for all of these dummies and making sure that they're okay. And I'm gone, and Aaron, you were supposed to be responsible. Do you hate these people so much that you would do what they want rather than what God wants them to do, and like you'd let that happen? And Aaron's like, no, it's not like that, Moses. Like, you know how stubborn they are. And like, they were insisting. And so like, I had to. And then, so we just, I said, hey, let's get some gold together. And we put the gold in the fire and this calf came out. Not like I carved it, but like, just put the gold in the fire and this calf came out. Like, he's not taking accountability here, right? Like, it's the people's fault. Oh, it just came out of the fire that way. It just happened. Like, this is not someone taking accountability for his actions. This is just, all these things happened to me. I don't know. I have no agency here. It's just, all this stuff happened. You weren't here, and things just started happening. What a great leader, right? Like, you're definitely, when things happen around you that you have no say in, that you're very qualified for leadership in that. Yeah. Horrible excuse. We threw the gold in the fire and this calf came out. Like, nobody's buying that, Aaron. That's really, really bad excuse. And his unwillingness to accept agency, I'm honestly surprised that Aaron survives this whole ordeal. But we'll see, he does. But this is the priesthood. This guy. We threw the gold in the fire and this calf came out, or the people made me do it. This is the high priest, the first high priest of the people, and the representative of the priesthood, and whose name and office are associated with. This is the Aaronic priesthood that comes from this. Is it any wonder that it doesn't go so well when it starts this way? And that's the other big point for reflection here is, like father, like sons, right? And sons and sons and sons and sons. And it just sort of, this is how most of the priesthood functions. Here an important thing happens also. So the Aaronic priesthood gets off to a very rocky start. the tribe of Levi gets off to a slightly better start. Um, Now, there's no saying that like everybody's gathered around, they're breaking loose. What exactly that means, there's debate. Um, at any rate, they're definitely like behaving. We still talk about behaving loosely as not a good thing, right? Um, you can just take it as this is not good, right? And is described as shameful among their enemies as well, right? That things are happening that are not good. And Moses says, okay, anybody who's still on the Lord's side, come here. And the Levites volunteer. Are we saying the Levites were there, right? And who are the ones who were there? So they're not necessarily not guilty of these things that have just been happening, for clarity's sake. Like, they're not necessarily like, they've all been praying in their tents while everybody else has been engaged in debauchery. But when Moses comes back down and says, okay, no, guys, who's on, right? This is an opportunity for conversion and repentance, right? Moses says, who's on God's side? Then they say, okay, yeah, we are. So they might not have been, 5 minutes ago, but now, given the opportunity, they say, nope, our bad. Like, yep, we're with God and not this calf. Like, we get it. Whoops. We repent, which is the thing. And probably not every one of the Israelites was engaged in all of this debauchery either, by the way, right? Like, as we're going to see, like, a smaller contingent of people could get something like this going, right? It wouldn't have to be everybody that started it that's doing it. Everybody else could be there could be a lot of people waiting back and not directly engaged in this, which is what we'll see in a minute. So what do the Levites do when they've repented? What is it, or when they've aligned themselves with Moses at the least? What is it that Moses says they should do? Well, grab your swords. We've got some killing to do. And all the people gathered around where this debauchery was happening. Levites grab their swords and they're going to kill them all. This is a violation constituting and meriting death, right? It is a grave sin, and the punishment for a grave sin is death, which Moses sees carried out. All the people anybody who might have stood by and not been directly involved, again, we'll see, like, grave sin, punishment is death. I won't get ahead of us. We'll talk about the rest in the next question. So they kill 3,000 people, 3,000 men. Again, suggesting maybe not everybody was doing this, right? Like, it's a lot of people, but, if they didn't kill everyone, that kind of implies that there were some people who were maybe not comfortable with what was happening, and fence sitting or just removing themselves from the situation, right? They weren't stopping it. They weren't saying, hey guys, no, you really can't do that. Like, didn't you see all the earthquakes and the lightning around the mountain a couple weeks ago? Like, remember Moses bringing us out of Egypt, like, and now you're saying this calf did, like, don't do that, or we're gonna have to take action. You can't do that. They took no action and stood around and let that happen. So they're still very culpable, but they're not killed here, right? So 3,000 people get put to the sword. And Moses says to the Levites, you've ordained yourselves for the service of the Lord by doing this. The start of the service of the tribe of Levi of God is they're ordained in blood. and in the blood of, well, heretics, but they're also their kin, but their kin who are heretics. And that blood, in some ways, becomes the sacrifice that allows righting the relationship of all of the people with God as well, right? So Levites aren't priests, right? Priests are Levites because Aaron is from the tribe of Levi. So you have descendants of Aaron can be priests. Because Aaron is a Levite, all of those descendants of Aaron are also Levites. But then you have all the Levites who aren't descended from Aaron, who help with the service of God and all of the things around that, but who are not themselves priests. Not unlike we have deacons today, who can undertake some parts of the service of God, but there are other things that are reserved to priests. It's not dissimilar from that. And so the Levites gain a function and a role in the service of God unique to them from this act that was not originally. The tribe of Levi was, like the other tribes. And from here on out, that's not true. And they have a special place that we'll see develop over time. But the whole tribe gets carved out for the service of God. So while Aaron did a really bad thing, the tribe kind of lifted up, the Levites kind of lifted that up a little bit. It is, of course, also true that Moses and Aaron are brothers, so Moses is also a Levite. There might have been, if these tribes are kind of like tighter knit groups or clubs or societies of some sort, then we know they become more and more that way later. They probably are a little bit already. Then when Moses is asking for help, it might be more about who's asking than about God. But nonetheless, they rally to the call and they volunteer. And so that becomes a perpetual thing for these people, that the Levites are carved out. I guess that's kind of a pun I didn't mean to make. They kind of carved themselves out in the blood of these heretics. The service of the Lord is, especially back then, but is a violent thing. And right, like we think of Jesus as, a nice guy. And so, we sanitize Jesus to the point that like the image we have of him is meaningless a lot of the time, right? He's just this warm, cuddly, nice guy. He was very loving, and he could be very nice, and he could be very confrontational and even violent. He fashions a whip out of some cords and drives some people from the temple with it, right? Like, because this is not a space where that's allowed. Like, which is very much like what happens here, right? You're doing in a sacred or at all things that you aren't allowed to do. Violence is the remedy. You're selling things in the temple where you should not be. Violence is the remedy. Or humanity is doomed and has no way to pay the debt of their sin. Violence is the remedy. Jesus is not inherently opposed to violence. And again, the fact that our salvation comes through violence means that we really ought to understand that there is a part of the root of our faith and our salvation that is violent and always will be. Like, we should be doing violence to ourselves. The spiritual life is described as a war many times for a reason, right? Like, we are by nature like these people at the bottom of the mountain, and we need to do things to keep ourselves in line, like the Levites, right? Like, we need internally to have those guards that say, let's find those things that would worship that calf. Let's grab the sword and put them to death. Right? Like, what's happening here is what we're meant to be doing. We have to put parts of ourselves to death to serve God better. Otherwise, so much of me will just stand there and stand by while a minority portion goes and does horrible things. And then we'll be surprised when, oh, that wasn't like good enough. Like, oh, we're all collectively in trouble now, right? We need to not let those parts of ourselves that are leaning toward and inclined toward sin be setting the path, right? And if what we have to do that is some manner of violence, then that's how service of God looks. That's what it looks like. But now, we shouldn't be doing violence to others. That's a whole other thing. But like our individual salvation is purchased with and ratified through violence to first Jesus and then ourselves, right? Jesus generally, the violence that he ultimately did was, or allowed, was to himself. And that's the model for us as Christians. We're not inflicting it outward, we're internalizing it and directing it in a way that is focused toward the things that are leading us from God. But violence and sacrifice baked into, not like an incidental, like obsolete part of the worship of God. Still very much as important and relevant and foundational today as it was then. Moses now needs to try to make things right. The relationship between the people and God is severed. So back up the mountain right away, again, Moses goes to attempt to make things right. And here his argument is, I'm not going to say they didn't sin. They did. I'm not going to say they don't deserve to be wiped out. They do. But you should still forgive their sin. And if you're not going to forgive their sin, then punish me along with them. Blot me out too of your book if you're blotting them out. If you're not forgiving them. And God says, Moses, it doesn't work that way. I will hold sin against those who have sinned, and I will not hold sin against those who have not sinned. That's the covenant, right? If you sin, you die. If you don't sin, you do not die. It's so important because this idea of inflict on me their punishment, the same punishment as them as well, and God saying it doesn't work that way, is such foreshadowing of Christ. Because Jesus ultimately says more or less exactly the same thing Moses does, right? It's not blot me out, it's kill me. But it's if these people, what has to happen to them is death, for the debt to be paid, then kill me. But by the rules of that covenant, if you sin, you die. If you don't sin, you don't die. Jesus can't die, right? Because he hasn't sinned. So he puts himself, nevertheless, as Moses is trying to do, in the place to join with them and to represent the people in being the first to be killed for their sins. And he can't die, so he can be the second, and the third, and the fourth, and the 5 billionth, and the 20 billionth. And he's still not dead because he has not sinned. So what Moses is offering here is what Jesus does. And God says, Moses, you're not doing that. I'm not going to do that to you. But like the intuition, the idea of Moses here for what to do is Christ-like. It's I will sacrifice myself for these people. But unlike Jesus Christ, Moses would not survive the effort, right? Like that would be the end of Moses. And that is not what God wants. So God says, no, Moses, you're not the one to do that. And then he kind of repeats the covenant, which he doesn't say no one should do that. He just says, hey, here's the covenant. And that also kind of explains why Moses isn't the one. Moses, very holy guy, not perfect. He cannot undergo the trial that Jesus, he can't survive what Jesus does. So just a fascinating thing though, in that Moses is willing to put himself in the place of what Jesus does, for the sake of these people who just did that. And that's great job, Moses, right? It shows us how much Moses has learned from God, right? He went from, oh, I can't speak to Pharaoh, to blot me out with them, to God. Like, huge character arc for Moses, right? Like, this guy is a really big deal, and such a strong foreshadowing of Jesus Christ in that regard. And God also leaves it with, there's so much foreshadowing here. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them, right? This whole thing is foreshadowing of, this whole bit in this section is foreshadowing of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice. It's fantastic. And the Lord sent a plague upon the people because they made the calf which Aaron made. To be continued on that front. Nice cliffhanger there. They don't get off scot-free. Something else is going to happen. But we'll get more into that later. But sin has consequences, right? Like, even now, Moses has managed to stall God's anger for the people. He's not going to kill them all. He's not going to stop being their God. There is still a price to pay. Sin has still been committed. There is still a price to pay. It's just the price is lowered. Moses has deferred or delayed the majority of God's wrath, but there is still something to happen. This has been an overview of Lesson 24 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. You shall have no other gods, the book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.